Okay, I'm going to open this up to questions, but can I have the first one?
Yes.
Which is about it's a kind of point of hope and despair for me, kind of personally, is how do you build, and we've been talking about this a lot in other contexts during the week, a cross-class environmental movement. Because certainly in the UK, the debate gets polarised between the extraordinarily wealthy, who are generally seen to be lecturing working class people about their own consumption habits. So Rupert Murdoch can tell us all to go green, but we know that his personal carbon footprint is, ginormous. Sienna Miller can tell us she doesn't take showers, she doesn't take baths, she takes showers on the radio.
On the
but
radio?
the average, she's on the radio saying, don't take baths, take showers. I'm an actress and I know about this kind of thing. But to the average working class person who thinks, I just want to go on holiday to Spain once a year, I don't want to be lectured by these people. So that's highly problematic, the kind of class issue, I think. But it seems to me that the hope aspect is possibly the potential for a kind of global coalitions. Because if you're a poor person in the global south, this affects you much more directly. I mean, this is really, if you're in Bangladesh or in lots of places in the global south, there's a much more direct and imminent impact. So it seems to me that there's a possibility between, strange thought, but the rich in the global north and the poor in the global south that doesn't exist between the rich and poor in the global north, possibly. And I just wondered what you thought about the kind of cross-class issue.
Well, the class issues are really very difficult. There's an aspect of the environmental movement called environmental justice, which deals with things like environmental racism, which you might have heard about. It's kind of pattern of location of toxic dump sites near communities of people of color. And it's a pattern and has been reproduced over time, and it's in the global north. And you see this, as I said, production, workplace hazards. You'll find probably disproportionate numbers of people of color and women exposed to these toxins. There are efforts within the unions to try to deal with these. OSHA, again, a federal agency which is supposed to deal with these hazards here. So there's some protections here. But as far as solidarity across class, it's difficult because you don't want to deny somebody their air conditioner on a hot day. But the international issues, I'm not sure how that would actually be easier myself, except that there are activists who do promote and raise awareness of the inequalities and stratification of where we dump the bad stuff, and also the question of should the fat West tell the thin Chinese or Indian you cannot develop.
Yeah.
You cannot go through the same process of industrialization that we did to get the standard of living. There's an ethical, a political question there that has to be dealt with. The good thing is that all the mistakes we've made in the West are documented now and known, and there's a kind of checklist of things that are no-nos, and also with the Olympics raising such a big stink about the stink. The Chinese have made some efforts to more quickly than the UK of the 19th century, the US of the 20th century, more quickly to develop and design industrial production techniques which are going to reduce or integrate carbon emissions or energy waste into less wasteful practices. So there are, and it's all for profit. Obviously, they're not ethical questions so much as they are questions of whether or not these green industries will find a niche in a marketplace. More and more consumers want to deal with more and more green corporations. There's a rising number in consumer opinion that corporations and the government should take on more responsibility for recycling and for the maintenance and preservation of the environment. The environmental movement on a global scale is the fastest growing, biggest political movement in history. It has a more diverse assemblage of constituencies. I don't know if that's a proper way to put it, but it is massive, it's diverse, and it's growing. And so I'd say there's hope there as well. There are different levels of effort, different scales of effort, from recycling to people who are out there and working with Greenpeace, taking action, putting their bodies online. But still, the chemical industries that were responsible for, for toxic explosions in Bhopal still haven't paid up. Their enforcements are lax. The international regulatory agencies have a hard time enforcing the trade agreements in hazardous wastes. And so you can organize around those problems, but if you don't have the national states working to enforce some of these laws, then you're back into despair mode, actually.
We're back to the despair
Yeah.
moment, or the role of big institutions.
Yeah. But let me just say something about despair. Any of you have ever taught a political economy course? It's usually the third or second week where you're dealing with a lot of depressed students. And so, that's when the ethical and political discussion has to shift to the hopeful. And what you're learning is about the empirical political economy. What you're learning is about the empirical devastation of the planet Earth. And what you do then, in terms of your activities in life or how you teach, are going to be influential because maybe you have that awareness. You want to do the
Yeah.
Brandon?
Yep.
Is this working?
Yep.
I had two questions. First of all, thank you so much for the talk. The first question is about if you could maybe just talk a little bit more about some of the new studies that have come out about cell phones. I've been searching around and I'm having trouble finding some stuff, but I have a friend whose, I guess, brother-in-law works for a cell phone company, and he doesn't even own a cell phone. From kind of the internal documents that he's seen floating around. So
Yeah.
I'm curious as to what you found. And two, just back to your aside comment at the beginning about experimental forms of research and kind of working collaboratively. I was just really curious as to kind of how you and Toby have gone about co-authoring a project like this.
The carbon footprint is very large.
Well, maybe, but thinking about how it is that you kind of embark on working together on a project like this one.
Let's begin with something bigger than a cell phone. Let's begin with a transmission tower. Let's say that you're a telecom worker. Hopefully you turn it off before you climb the tower to do any kinds of adjustments. But if you are working in an office in Manhattan and you are within a certain range of the broadcast tower across the street on the building next to you, your exposure to the electromagnetic fields, to damaging non-ionizing radiation, is very high. This is well known, but they don't usually put a sign on the door of that employee saying, be careful, you might want to put lead curtains up. The cell phone is a smaller version of that. Okay, it's a broadcast tower. It's just a miniature version of a broadcast tower. As far as the electromagnetic frequencies go. There are a lot of deniers, especially in the press. There's a guy named John Tierney who writes for the New York Times, who's just a terrible, terrible guy when it comes to it. He says, don't worry about it, eat uranium, embrace the atom. We were all wrong about that. Go on, kiddies, go put your face up against the TV screen. He's one of these guys,
He's wrong about a whole lot else.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, you'll vomit when you're reading it. But the point is that, it's not well known. And the research is coming out of, I think the more recent studies was an American-Danish study, and then there was, I think, an Israeli study as well. They're doing long-term research on exposure to non-ionizing radiation coming from the cell phone. And let's see if this. Okay. And it's exponential. The further away you hold the phone, of course, the less radiation is going to go into your brain. But you can go online and find the MRI pictures that show how far in it goes into the adult brain, and how far in it goes into the brain of an infant. It's recommended that children under the age of 7 not have a phone, and only in emergencies should children use cell phones. It was just a couple of weeks ago that the head of the Cancer Research Institute at University of Pittsburgh, issued this warning. And the warning was more of a memo to the employees there. It says, I have just read a soon-to-be-published long-range study that the World Health Organization conducted. And it's not out yet, but I really think that I should tell you some stuff that I got out of this report. And here are 10 things I want you to do. Don't use your cell phone if you don't have to. Try to use an earbud if you can. Don't let children use it. If you do have to use it, change sides frequently. This is the head of cancer research. telling his workers what to do. Turn it off if you're not using it. Use a landline. There were other recommendations there. Toby, do you remember any of the more curious ones?
Well, one of the interesting things, in terms of finding the studies and so on,
Yeah.
they're not hard to find. There are a lot of them online, but you can also go to YouTube and watch the guy who's got brain cancer that he attributes to this driving a tank into a telecommunications system.
Oh, God, yeah.
This is quite-
That's an Australian again, right?
It is an Australian guy who's in jail.
Stole the tank and tried to knock down a communications tower.
In most world countries, the leading cause of death for young people under 20 is now brain cancer. For the first time in history. And I think there might be possibly one explanation for this. The guy who did most of the major studies for the US authority, private sector authority, that is the industry representative for cell phone technology, all the studies were canned. The software that he put them on was destroyed. His house was burnt down. And when he tried to put his private stash of his stuff up on a website, the website was bombed.
Okay, electromagnetic, what's that bell just rang? Electromagnetic frequencies are circulating through this room right now, so, be afraid, be very afraid. Let me just comment on, real quickly on the collaboration issue. How do you initiate this? How would it work, or?
More, what your methodology is kind of moving ahead is, and some of the advantages that have kind of come out of the collaboration, but also kind of nuts and bolts. How do you guys, how have you gone about co-authoring?
Well, real quickly, I mean, there's a certain kind of combination of expertise and interests, and then there's a division of labor, and then there's Global Hollywood is another example. I don't know if you're familiar with that work. Toby primarily wrote most of it, so I contributed one, and then did a lot of the editing work, and then worked with the others, and then we broke things up, and then there was a kind of at the end kind of rewriting the whole thing. This one we're working on is kind of do this, and then we'll talk about additions that can be made, and then we're going to piece it all together. But breaking down what were important pieces of this: the eco crisis, ecological history, life cycle analysis, environmental justice, ecoethics, and then what's next in movement terms. Came pretty naturally through just what's out there and what needs to be done. As I said, it's not a synthetic work because there's nothing really out there. So this one's a little peculiar. So depends, division of labor. It depends on how well you work with people. We telecommunicate a lot on this. And when we fly, obviously the carbon footprint's a little higher. Let me just add, I was going to say one more thing about cell phones, but I'll hold it. What was the question?
Yeah. Hold on.
Oh, Sana.
Three.
Three.
Three questions. Keep them.
I have no questions actually. Three very short comments. Actually, a year ago, we had an Indian sociologist, Professor Uberoy, giving a lecture at our institute. So he was talking about technological obsolescence, by which he meant that before a technology or a technological piece completely expends its lifespan, a new thing gets created. And I sometimes feel the same restlessness is in cultural production also. Of course, they're all interlinked. Before you completely, take in the cultural form or the cultural artifact, it dies. It's the same with technology. It dies, and something, new comes up, which is not actually new, but claims the death of something that it succeeded. So this, this very fast death of technology. I mean, we can see it because ordinary televisions are now being disposed for a flat screen, and now after, say, 1 year, we just dispose that for a new equipment. So this technological obsolescence is something that needs to be examined much more carefully and probably linked to consumption-driven economy. I mean, those large questions need to be probably asked. And my second comment is on and sometimes I feel that the solution for this problem is state regulation. You could ask the state to say that, this is the lifespan of this particular technology, so you better, use it for the next 3 decades and don't innovate it on this front because we don't need it. That's one possible, solution. But, there are problems with that. And I just give you one example of a very interesting state legislation that has come up in India. It is Information Rights Act. I'm sure you guys have it for a long time now. I do not know, but in India it is pretty new. And this legislation allows citizens to petition the state for information on any of its activities and measures and projects. This has led to information-hungry citizens, and this has led to a lot of queries, and a lot of papers get wasted, a lot of time gets wasted, and believe me, it's really, and it borders on a myth that information provision is a solution that the state is offering. Many times it borders on that myth, and it is also, leading to several environmental problems. So many silly questions get asked, and so many papers get, used up to answer these questions. So sometimes state regulation or state legislation can be tricky. And the third point is on duplication of records, both in the state institutions as well as in the corporate. So on the one hand, we are talking about new emerging technologies. So we store all the data in the new technology, but still we feel so insecure that we keep the same data in the papers. So, we probably need to examine state institutions as well as corporate institutions for these practices, and not just media institutions. That's what I was trying to get at. And also kind of, draw on policy studies to understand how state regulations are having, influences on media technologies and what they are generating. Yeah, thanks.
Can I respond to that?
Very
Quickly. Already with the early radio production, consumers were out there, buying new radios every 9 months, touting the number of tubes that they had. So my radio has 9 tubes, so mine has 12. So they were already, selling this idea of conspicuous consumption and taking advantage of the obsolescence, which caused these problems. But the cell phone is thrown away in the U.S. At least. They've replaced them every 12 months now, which causes a lot of waste. And let me just add that there's one general life cycle assessment on cell phones that resulted in the following conclusions. The best way to resolve these issues is to have one company, one standard, and one place to go with a phone that you never throw away or throw away very rarely, and have a central way to recycle it, and then you'd have better quality, which again would require state regulation, would require a regulated monopoly, it would have all of these other problems that come with it. But that's what an environmentally sound cell phone system would look like, and probably one that has better quality.
Here, and then we've got two over there.
Okay, is it on? Okay, so I, again, just wanted to thank you and say, as someone who's lived in Rochester for the past 7 years, it was especially
Don't drink the water.
To, hear about Kodak. And I just wanted to, speaking back to Kate's comment and question about class and race, it's especially true in Rochester that you can kind of link up Kodak's completely racist labor practices with, meaning that if non-whites could get a job, they got the most toxic and dangerous jobs and were the first laid off, and then also ended up living in the areas that are the most polluted by Kodak. And then another just quick story about last summer when Kodak imploded 2 of their buildings. Their footprint in Rochester is shrinking as they continue to lay off employees and move production elsewhere. They branded this event through hanging banners on the building that the 2 buildings that they were imploding, and through a video that circulated on YouTube as Kodak sort of finally responding to the digital shift, and this was sort of a streamlining of their production, and it was somehow good for Kodak and good for Rochester that they were going to be doing this, more digital work, and so they branded it as a nice day for a revolution. And they then blew up these buildings, getting the laid-off employees to do the symbolic detonation of it, and then the toxic particles blew out over the city, and yeah, that's it.
No, really don't drink the water.
Did they study the?
I'm sure just, I don't know exactly what's happening with that.
I guess I have two questions. One is a question on the science of this. In other words, I think the public is so confused by all these particular studies that come out, some pro, some con, on on the arguments, right? So as a media person or as a person, historian or whatever, how does one go about selecting, for example, the studies that one uses to support an argument? Is it solely because this particular cancer expert strengthens your particular argument? Whoops, I don't know, my stuff's falling out here. But so how does one go about doing that? And is it sheer faith on science that we go ahead and make these selections? And the other question I have is looking back through history, when we talk about Gutenberg's workshop, which I found very, very interesting, your comments that you make about it, and we have all these particular chemicals that you brought out. How does one distinguish whether, or is it even important to say, well, these particular persons, and I don't think you said it, but nonetheless, these people working in Gutenberg's workshop, right, were poisoned by chemicals, or is it maybe parasites, or is it maybe disease, or is it viral, or is it bacterial that this comes about, that their illness comes about? And perhaps there'll be a third question or a third comment. All of the symptoms that you went ahead and gave us, right, were not solely symptomatic, I don't think, of chemical poisoning or of even microwave poisoning. Some of this stuff, you can say, well, it's high blood pressure, it is even diabetes, it is tuberculosis, et cetera, et cetera. So those symptoms are not necessarily symptoms of chemical poisoning or of microwave poisoning.
Yeah, let me go from that last to the first. That study was done by Soviet scientists who had looked at a large number of workers exposed to microwave frequencies. So you can look at the science and say, well, the correlations were done, and they pulled out what they thought would have been intervening variables and all of that. That's something you can actually look at and see what the methodology was, because it wasn't just a crackpot saying this is happening. And again, with the Gutenberg issue, really this was, there's an epidemiological history in media technologies that needs to be done. We don't know what happened in those days. We can speculate what they would be exposed to, but we don't know what any kind of harms were. So I don't make any claims to know what they died of. But I can tell you that these processes really became much more intensive in the 19th century with industrialization of the process, the enlargement of these processes, the mechanical and chemical changes that took place to address the issues of rising demand in paper and print, with growing literacy and demand from readers in the 19th and early 20th century. So you really can nail it down better in those periods what's happening. But it wasn't the toxicological studies still weren't being done until later on in the 20th century. And even as I said, because they didn't track toxic waste until the 1950s, there's an assumption that, hey, it's lost to history. We won't know. So a lot of this really requires people saying, no, well, I'm going to try to find it. I'm going to try to find out, and perhaps opening up a line of epidemiological research onto these technologies that we're concerned with in this field. So, yeah, I mean, read the research. Don't listen to the popularized reports on TV about it. And when you get to the issues of science and faith, talk to your colleagues in environmental science to ask them that question. The climatologists will have one set of issues to deal with global warming. There might be others in the health health area in your university who might be able to help you understand the toxicological issues. They're very careful. They're very balanced, and especially the ones who are going to issue reports. They kind of issue only conservative publications, but when you get them alone, they start to talk about the range of opinion, scientific opinion that they respect, and that the rising water level is predicted to be here. Some of them think it's going to be 3 times that much, and all caused by the melting of the polar ice caps.
That was my first question. How do you make that decision? How do you, as a scholar, decide, well, I'm going to use this opinion over this opinion?
It depends how much I want to scare my audience, really. Oh, I went to, I did attend, just quickly, in my college we have a great environmental science program, and I attended a panel, and they were speaking this way. We publish this, we know this is what is the accepted opinion. It's already bad, what they tell you. And then they say, but we also know that it's potentially this. And so there's a range of potential outcomes with global warming. And they do have predictions of what the particulate matter in the air that's causing this greenhouse effect, the covering up effect. They have a number that we are trying to avoid, and they're already issuing this out. But it's very hard for people to understand. It's not being popularized through the media, especially by Fox and others who just deny the science.
Okay. Yep.
Okay, I'd just like to ask a very kind of more fundamental question and a very trivial one. How should I put this? Well, like you said, with every new tech, new and probably toxic elements would be introduced into the environment, and so the pollution of the environment probably goes way back, and that's probably why why there are people in the ecological movement who actually argue that the problem is not technology, it's actually the human beings themselves. So the removal of the human beings is essential to the protection of the environment. Personally, I think it's too extreme. But how then it all comes down to the question as to what are the lesser evils that we should put up with in order to survive, and what are the greater evils that we actually need to try to remove from the environment. So where do we draw the line?
Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions? That's the first question. And the second, more trivial one is that I heard that even microwaved food cannot be, are not good for our health. Is that true?
Yes.
Well, don't stick your head in it. Let me answer the first one, because it goes to the issue of ecological ethic, ecocentrism versus anthropocentrism, a kind of light green, practical, pragmatic, human-centered kinds of solutions to the earth-first extremist solutions that, the planet will do well once we're gone and it will recover itself. So bye-bye, it doesn't matter. There are no hard and fast rules here, but we're talking about a philosophical, thinking through these problems together as a collectivity, and in different constituencies will have different issues that they'll want to deal with. So in an anthropocentric kind of debate, you might find people who want to preserve the owl population, in particular old-growth forest, because they appreciate the presence of the owl. They like the animal, it's aesthetic, an issue for them, and they want to protect the animal, kind of mid-green ecological ethics. But then there's the lumber community and the economy of those families, and how they are going to have to deal with the restrictions on lumbering, and what are the compromises that are going to be made. And these are real cases where they'll do some sort of cost-benefit analysis and on the ground come up with some practical solutions to save some of the forests, to save some of the owls, to save some of the peoples and their economies and their livelihoods. There are compromises being made. But the ecocentrists would say, should the humans always win out in these? Shouldn't the earth win sometimes? And when it comes to, and the example in one of the readings had to do with high-end glossy magazines. And the number of trees, 35 million trees, and the amount of water used, and the kind of the virgin forests that are used in the Cosmopolitan, Vogue, etc., glossy magazines, because of the nature. It's cheaper to use virgin forest than it is to recycle, and the recycling it has its own problems in terms of energy consumption. Do we need that many high-end glossy magazines? Do we need them? And they might provide pleasure, but can there be a compromise? Do they have to be glossy? What's the pleasure? Is it the glossy pictures? Do we need these are, insert some sort of ecocentric ethics into that discussion, and pretty soon those glossy magazines don't look so great. They don't look like they're that great for the planet. And then the question of users and lifestyle and consumption, maybe that one should, maybe people should lose that argument. That's one that I think people could lose. Cell phones, it's a harder one, because it's done so much to link people in hard times.
Okay, there's lots and lots of hands, so I'm going to be quite directed here. Yeah, you first, and then a couple over here, then we'll come back over here.
Okay, so one of the things that you mentioned in passing yesterday was the role of schools in fostering a sort of environmental awareness, and I was wondering what kind of curricular content you would encourage. And the related question to that is, in terms of forming these cross-racial and cross-class coalitions, how would you propose that we integrate this curricular content in schools, underprivileged schools that are often more likely in these sites, in these places where there are these waste dumps and so forth, when a lot of times these schools don't have enough teachers, they don't have enough resources, et cetera? How would you integrate sort of this environmental curriculum?
Yeah, those are, well, the curriculum challenge is not so hard. I mean, if you're talking about public schools and curriculum, if you're talking about university level curriculum, in my field, well, you get to be the chair of the department, and then you can make some changes. But the point is that we need to have a deeper ethical education in media studies, for example, around these issues. Right now, there is a certain technophilia, a certain embrace of all new technologies. New media is so sexy and so hot. It's like one of the #1 job descriptions in the field these days. Without a dimension that has to do with is this good? What are the environmental issues? So you can incorporate that into program's curriculum. You can make it a part of the curriculum, and I've even proposed a graduate program for CUNY that involves on-the-ground research, bringing back studies to the companies, media companies themselves, to try to draw their attention to design issues and like life cycle assessment kinds of things. So there are ways to do it at the graduate level. The public education system in the United States is fucked, not because of anything except political will to fuck it. I mean, I'm sorry to put it in those terms, but we've had these cutbacks that have just caused these issues, and we could start there for one thing, vote Democrat, and at least, and then work from there, because it's not just environmental issues. There's no art, there's no music. The humanities are disappearing at the elementary school level. Not where my son is, thankfully, but I understand what you're saying. There are communities that are disadvantaged, and first thing they're going to cut the art, the music, the humanities, and all that, and stick in science and math and English reading ability. And there won't be any funding for that. It's the school systems then have to find a way to create a structure that's green. But get involved with the PTA or the Parents Association. That's one other way on the ground. But structural issues have more to do with the cutbacks in public education and health and all that other stuff.
I really appreciated your focus on eco-politics and especially, I guess, the concerns about ecological racism, environmental racism. I'm wondering, though, are these movements, these political movements, you said the eco-political movement, the environmental movement is really massive, diverse, and growing, but are these movements really changing the politics, or are they simply changing the personnel and the sort of assemblages of the policy apparatuses? In other words, how the present system fits together rather than changing the present system. And as an example, I guess, a friend of mine is now involved in some ecological planning in Peoria, Illinois, cleaning up neighborhoods of color that have traditionally been neglected and polluted by companies like Archer Daniels, Midland, and stuff. But if this is just going to result in sort of a gentrification, and as we've been talking about, I guess, over the past few days, then sort of the meta pattern of ecological racism is still persisting. It's really eco-white supremacy, I guess, if we were to call it perhaps by its proper name, remains. And so I guess there's so many arguments about how the environmental crisis can change the politics. That some say, more state regulation, some say less, just make it more, incentivize. The state should be just involved in incentivizing and creating a green free market. But neither of these would really change the pattern of a lack of intersubjectivity, a lack of empathy, basically, between subjects of the global north, global south, et cetera. So what I'm wondering is how does the eco-crisis, and especially the distribution of ecological hazard exposure as a form of biopower, as a form of necropower, really require just a complete reformulation of political theory.
Well, let me start with more practical issues. That the Environmental Protection Agency distributes risks by saying that there are acceptable levels of exposure, and so communities that are located near, let's say, toxic wastes or whatever, the exposure levels will be tested, and there'll be a technical scientific limit to what is acceptable levels of exposure. Now, this is a peculiarly American way of doing things. And, you know, you might find something called the precautionary principle more active in the European context, where what you don't know, you know, if you don't know the science, if there's no consensus on the science about this, and there are disagreements, then it's a better safe than sorry policy, and then it's a much more universal application of that. Everybody will be saved from that. It won't distribute the risks disproportionately. But you know, the environmentalism that you're describing is not mine. It's not my version of it. It's one of those kind of concentric sorts of environmentalism where, you know, it's not interterritorial. It's not intergenerational. It's about the community now, you know, enjoying their, you know, green, you know, living campus, complex, or whatever you want to call it. And it's not about how it's affecting or the interconnections between the global north and the global south. My environmentalism is trying to be much more international. It's much more intergenerational. It's not about saving us now in the here and now and screwing people in the future. It's about something that's going to have lasting sustainability. And sustainability means indefinitely sustainable by the earth, to me. And that's, you know, we're a long way from that, but that's where I would begin that, to talk about, you know, what environmental policy would be the one that I would propose. It would require a massive mobilization of resources, you know, massive mobilization of people. It would involve things that we might not want to talk about, like militarization of the problem to get it fixed right now. I mean, that's how bad off I think it is myself. So, you know, and it's a global problem, and because it's, you know, we're living in a biosphere. It's not just ecosystems that are not connected. You know, we're at this point where we become a biospheric people. And you can't just defend one ecosystem without thinking about, you know, how this is going to intersystemically. So that's not, you know, what you're describing. It's not my environmental policy, but I understand where you're coming from.
Okay, Thea?
I have an observation that speaks to perhaps a larger blindness in discussions about the production of culture. Media technology does get made in factories, but someone somewhere designs that product and that object. And I teach in a design school, and there is a big discussion, a big sort of conversation among designers about their role. And I think it's too facile to say, oh, they're all complicit because to get a product manufactured, it has to go through a corporation. You can change ethics at, it sounds so accommodationist, change ethics at the individual level in that end of the process. And there is a, you know, maybe that's one of the other communities you can bring into this idea of media studies, because it's also media design.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And there are the life cycle assessment researchers are very keen on design issues, you know, replacing one chemical for another chemical, replacing one component for another component that is more ecologically friendly, but also performs the same function.
Okay, one more over here. Juan and then.
It is. Okay, so Richard, I'm trying to collapse a question I meant to ask you yesterday with a question that I wanted to ask you today. So let's see how it goes. By the end of Angela McRobbie's talk yesterday, we found out that about 2 or 3 miles from some of the design centers that whose practitioners she studied, the sweatshops where the material production of some of these designs is carried out, were located. In the different images that you showed us yesterday, you insisted by the juxtaposition of the images on this is what's behind or made invisible in your use of or your wearing of whatever. Yes? so that we would get the Chinese workers that made possible the beads, or we will get, that was your insistence. And you were saying, think about this that has been made invisible or rendered invisible. And I want to make the comment at two levels. The Global South, Global North denominations are problematic because one of the things that have changed is that we can no longer distinguish between the third world down there and the first world up here, because the third world lives right here in LA, right next to the first world, and that is a distinctive feature of globalization. And to the same extent that the first world lives in Rio de Janeiro next to the third world or even the fourth world. So that the issues of visibilizing, making visible the connections that are obscured by capitalism in its global moment need to apply not simply to connecting the global south to the global north as geographical entities, but also within the urban centers that we normally live in the third world or the first world. With that in mind, I was thinking the problem of environmental discourse oftentimes is that it appeals to the highest common denominator, which is the species. And you started talking by saying, and guess who has been the species that has most polluted in history? Us, humans. And the fact is that that comment, which is true of course, has to be combined with geopolitics and political economy to make more precise what part of the species has been polluting the most and is most responsible for the cleanup and the payment of the cleanup. And so to me, and this is where I'm coming to the more practical comment or question, is the kind of history that you and Toby are trying to write would be so much stronger if, in addition to making the history of the environmental impact of media technologies, you included social ecology in the issue, along the lines of social justice or environmental justice that you already mentioned, but also along the lines of lifestyle and social organization and the kinds of individualization processes that we have gotten used to and dependent upon that are connected to our use of media technologies. That is to say, it's not simply the history of environmental impact of media technologies, but it's also how is it that by changing lifestyles and the connection between lifestyles and media technologies and individualizations, we in the first world, as the 5% of most concentrated polluters of the species, could actually make a significant difference, and that is also part of the future of media environmental impact history.
Okay. I endorse fully the first 2 points, and I will make sure that you get the third point in the book.
We've got another paper, so I'm going to have to cut this a bit short. Can we just have maybe 2 more questions? Just yes. 2 more, I'm sorry.
The question that I have is something that I think maybe gets at some of the larger issues of some of the things we've been talking about but haven't talked about specifically, and that's building consensus for a political project, just as our role as academics. And one of the things that I was thinking was when you were talking about that the media reform movement needs to be dealing with this issue much more, which I have to say I fully agree with you. Nobody in media reform is talking about this. But my gut tells me that the media reform movement would be resistant to embracing this as an issue. I think that, they would say, we're hanging on, our goal is more democratic media through education, and, there's other ways that this can happen. There would be other ways that this can happen. For example, something like, a year ago there was the Live Earth concerts, which were all about, environmentalism. But I remember flipping through the channels, and the Live Earth concerts were being broadcast on NBC and Sundance, which are both owned by GE, right? So, I mean, I think that maybe my question is, how do we break down some of the divisions that exist between our own missions that we have for these projects in order to build a consensus that, this is tremendously important. I guess I'm just curious on your thoughts.
Well, on the media reform, we've talked about McChesney about this, and he thinks it rocks. He thinks the issue rocks. It's one of the biggest crises of the media right now. But the media reform movement and free press in particular have picked their pick their battles very clearly, and that's where they focus their organizing and fundraising to, to do this. So it might require, creating Toby started a blog, Green Citizen. One thing to do is to create a groundswell through these kinds of meetings. Toby's taken the discussion to a number of venues around the world, in the UK and Mexico, and gotten great response. And we've been able to place op-eds on this in important papers in Argentina. So little by little, we're getting the media electronics focus out there, and it's more focused in terms of more focused at the consumer and raising awareness about these gadgets that we've come to love and depend on, and that tends to be the issue. And the media reform movement, slowly but surely, it's the long revolution. But the eco crisis kind of puts a little pressure on you not to be patient. But I think this is a way, and you begin to talk about things you'd add to a curriculum. Discussions in the classroom on media technology. You might have a history class that you're teaching, and you insert these questions and raise the ethical challenge and have that discussion with students. It's a great way to create to influence a generation of young scholars who hopefully will be greener than mine.
Okay, yeah, you've been waiting for ages. You're giving me the last one.
I'll be really brief. First, I wanted to comment to the idea of microwave food being bad for us. 10 years ago, I worked at a ConAgra plant in Ohio on an assembly line putting microwave popcorn in boxes. And it's since been found that people who work at that factory have lung disease.
Yeah.
But it's not because of the microwaves or any electronic material. It's because of the petroleum-based butter that's put on microwave popcorn. So in the case of microwave popcorn, it's not the microwave that's killing you, it's the butter, which you eat when you watch movies, I guess. But my question has to do with technological obsolescence. It has to do with the idea of designed obsolescence, that the creative industry is so complicit in the idea that technology becomes obsolescent after a while. And one of the things we're doing as educators is we're teaching people how to go into an industry where they're expected to design obsolescence in technology. And I was wondering if you could talk about the relationship between what we do pedagogically and teaching our students not just to be consumers of materials, but producers of materials in an indirect way, and how we're teaching them how discourse affects the use of raw materials.
It's hard. Everybody wants to get the next iPhone. You're not cool if you don't have it, even though they don't work as phones really well, if at all. I don't know. I mean, if I had to write a book, I'd put the old-fashioned mousetrap on the cover, because no one's been able to improve on that. It's pretty environmentally friendly, I think. Have to look into that. But there have been designs that persist and still do the job like that. And I'm sure if you wanted to catalog those, you probably could and put the challenge to design students to come up with gadgets that will last. Everybody tells me I should get a new car, but the car's fine. But they keep telling me, get a new car. I don't know where that comes from, to tell you the truth. It works fine. I still know how to fix it myself. I can change a tire. We're becoming we're becoming more like that, like the Wall-E type of, human, I think. But a lot of us are still do-it-yourself types, not in the Henry Jenkins sense, but I mean, we still know how to fix things and make them work. And there's, that issue as well. But the overly technological person, maybe not the best person, to talk to about this. Talk about people who really have a sustainable lifestyle and see what they need and what they use. And again, the ethical question boils down to questions of how much media is sufficient media to maintain a healthy democracy, to provide the cultural resourcefulness that we need to be creative and have pleasure. And it's a really important question, and there's no hard and fast answers. And in each context and conjuncture, we're going to come up with different answers, I think. So, and I know Angela is going to have something to say about this too. So.
Okay.
Okay with me.
Great. Thank you very much for that. Just one observation. I was just thinking that I've been in lots of these kind of similar sort of debates to this in Europe, and there's much more preoccupation with personal human health in the US. So make of that what you will.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's interesting.